Doctor Who is no stranger to misinformation. Rumours from Reddit, insiders from the Mirror, and live streamers in masks who definitely have no reason to lie about this year's special. Every other week it seems a new rumour or misquote is doing the rounds. Most are quickly debunked or forgotten, but some stick around and wrongly shape the perception of the show among fans and casual viewers. One of the most persistent and widely believed is that the Daleks' frequent appearances in the revival are due to a contractual obligation. The story goes that the rights to the famous pepper pots belong to the estate of their creator Terry Nation, who allow the BBC to use them on the condition they appear in every series. If the Daleks don't return at least once a year, the production team will lose the right to use them. This has been repeated in YouTube videos, on podcasts. Hell, I used to tell people this as a fun fact because I'm an annoying know-it-all.
This topic's being discussed in articles and video essays, but with the Daleks entirely absent from Shooting Gatwa's first season, I thought it was finally time to take a deep dive into one of Doctor Who's longest-standing myths. First, I know this phrase is overused, but I am not an expert.
Copyright is a complicated subject, and I do not at all claim to know the inner workings of the BBC or the Terry Nation estate. The facts in this video are based on research into the behind-the-scenes history of the Daleks.
If I got anything wrong, feel free to let me know in the comments. Or just comment anyway, the algorithm seems to like it.
During the classic series, writers typically retained the rights to their story and characters. This was because they were usually freelancers who the production team commissioned to write for the show, so were not employed by the BBC.
The BBC themselves own the rights to the Doctor and the TARDIS, but many of the show's most iconic elements still belong to their original creators.
For example, the Brigadier was created by writers Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln, and remains the property of the Haseman estate. The Cybermen, Sontarans, K9, they are all owned exclusively or partially by their original creators. This is how K9 creator Bob Baker was able to launch a spin-off show in Australia, and he had such strong control over the character that Chris Chibnall was unable to use him.
I'd love to have done K9, but we didn't get that. Jodie and K9 was the thing I wanted.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but you can't get the rights.
Oh, yeah, of course, the rights.
So, yeah.
Oh.
The Daleks were created in 1963 by writer Terry Nation.
So he owns the copyright? Not exactly.
While Nation receives most of the credit, the iconic design came from Raymond Cusick. Nation's script was reportedly quite vague, with the striking pepperpot-like shape being Cusick's creation. Script editor David Whittaker is said to have nursed Terry's dialogue and characterization, while directors Christopher Barry and Richard Martin put a lot of thought into how the creatures would be presented, with Martin suggesting that each Dalek be insane with claustrophobia. This informed the performances of the Dalek operators and the voice work of Peter Hawkins and David Graham.
Overall, the Daleks were very much a collaborative effort, but as the serial's writer, Nation received sole credit.
The monsters proved a huge success, with mountains of toys and merchandise being produced, making Terry pretty loaded by the mid-60s.
This indeed, then, Terry Nation, has made you a very rich man.
Well, richness is always relative, I suppose, but I am not poor.
The Daleks were so successful that Terry took them away from the show in 1967 to launch a spin-off series in America. This was less successful. Due to Cusick's involvement, a designer employed by the BBC, the Daleks became jointly owned by the BBC and Terry Nation.
Essentially, Nation owned the basic concept while the BBC owned the design.
This arrangement meant that when Barry Letts and Terrence Dicks planned to bring the Daleks back, Nation called in to explain that they were his Daleks. Following a meeting where he was invited to write for the next season, the BBC reportedly needed permission from Terry for each successive Dalek story. This continued until the end of the classic series, and after Terry's death, the rights transferred to his estate. Cut to 2004 and development is underway for the Daleks' return to TV. Russell T Davies envisioned them as the overarching villains of the 2005 series, and chose writer Robert Shearman to introduce them to a new generation. Concept designer Matthew Savage got to work reimagining the look, and it was here that the production team hit a stumbling block. In the summer, it was announced that the Daleks would not appear in the upcoming revival. Negotiations between the BBC and the Nation estate apparently broke down over issues of editorial control. The estate supposedly wanted greater input into the design, and their representative Tim Hancock felt the BBC was trying to ruin the brand of the Daleks.
He was not a fan of how the BBC had handled them in recent years, with most of his grievances coming down to Looney Tunes.
Yeah, the Daleks have an extended cameo in Back in Action, which the BBC approved without permission from the estate. Also, while it's heavily rumoured that cast member Steve Martin wrote an apology letter to the Nation estate which solved this rights dispute, I found nothing supporting this. It seems to originate from IMDb trivia, which, sorry to break it to you all, has never been very reliable.
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
The Terry Nation estate has historically been very protective of their biggest IP to a ridiculous extent, even pulling the plug on a Dalek porn parody leading to this incredible quote, "Daleks do not do porn."
Either way, the BBC and the estate couldn't reach an agreement, so a new storyline was developed along with a new villain.
For about 5 weeks, Robert Shearman worked on a new draft, jokingly titled Absence of the Daleks, about a race of metal spheres from the end of time, but producer Julie Gardner stayed in touch with the estate, allowing them to renegotiate, and by August, a new deal was reached, allowing the Daleks to return after all. And if those metal spheres sound familiar, that's because Russell reworked them into the Toclafane in Series 3. Always recycle, kids.
The terms of this agreement have never been made public, hence this rumour has persisted for so long. So where did it come from?
I first became aware of it through a 2014 video by Mr. TARDIS.
The Daleks are not owned by the BBC, they are being loaned to the BBC by the Terry Nation estate. The Daleks are like Spider-Man for Sony. If they stop making Spider-Man movies after a certain amount of time, they lose the rights. If they don't make an appearance every year while the program is being broadcast, then the Terry Nation estate gets the Daleks back and they'll have to rebuy them.
Now, he has specified in videos since that this is just a rumour, so you presumably just heard it somewhere and thought it was true.
And to the uninitiated, I can see why this idea makes sense. A similar agreement for Spider-Man exists between Marvel and Sony, hence we ended up with a whole Spider-Man universe with no Spider-Man. I did some research, meaning I literally searched through various date ranges on Google and found a Reddit thread dated to the 28th of July 2014, a month before Mr. TARDIS's video. A user attributes the Daleks' frequent appearances to a contractual obligation, while another believed this to be an anecdote that's been floating around since 2005. On another thread from 2018, a user was sure they'd read about this requirement from what felt like an official source in 2005. Well, that's helpful.
I searched far and wide for anything from 2005 to support this.
I tried every search term I could think of, I rewatched old episodes of Confidential, I even put the Daleks Wikipedia page through the Wayback Machine just in case it came from there. This is how I choose to spend my evenings.
Even after all of that, I can't find where this started.
There is a forum post from 2005, but that's not quite what we're looking for. With this lack of evidence, supporters of this myth use the Daleks' knack for returning constantly as the case for it being true.
So do the Daleks actually appear in every series? No.
Discounting cameos, specials and minisodes, Series 6, 10, 11, 12, Flux and the recent Season 1 all had no Dalek stories. If you refine this supposed requirement to every year, the Daleks were absent in 2016, 2018, 2020, 2023 and 2024, again not counting minisodes. Overall, the revived series has given us 12 definitive Dalek stories, with 23 appearances including cameos. All were approved by the Nation Estates since Terry is acknowledged as their creator in the credits of every episode they appeared in, except The Pandora Opens and Twice Upon a Time. Yes, I went back and checked. So worth it.
And if that wasn't enough to bring this contractual obligation into question, we've had 2 showrunners debunk it.
In November 2014, Stephen Moffat explained that you certainly don't wheel the Daleks out because you've got a contractual obligation to provide Daleks. He felt the show shouldn't go too long without them, since for kids, a year between Dalek stories is an eternity. Another response emerged in 2018 when Clayton Hickman, former editor of Doctor Who magazine, responded to a fan who inquired about this supposed obligation. Clayton claimed he'd never heard anything like that beyond fan lore, and although the original comment is deleted, he replied to another user on the same thread that the only source he's seen was fans on the internet. As recently as the 60th anniversary, Rusty Davis addressed this issue on his Instagram. A commenter again claimed that the BBC needed to use the Daleks to retain the rights. Russell replied that this was completely untrue.
This comment didn't get a lot of traction, but coming from the current showrunner, I think we can consider this an official debunking.
And yet, all 3 of these responses weren't enough for some people. After Moffat's response, some assumed he was lying or dancing around the subject. I've even seen fans try to argue, well, maybe it was real, but the rights have changed after the Disney Plus deal, which sounds to me like coping. They've spent so long believing they're going to perform any mental gymnastics necessary to keep believing.
I have no doubt that there are some complications with the rights.
There was even a court case where a publisher claimed to own the publishing rights to the Daleks, but the jury concluded these belonged to the BBC. The team behind Scream of the Shalka even faced difficulty securing the rights to the show because of the Daleks, but ultimately found no issue with the rights after all.
Copyright in Doctor Who is messy, but there's not as many restrictions as fans might think.
Big Finish initially could only tell stories with classic Doctors, but in 2015 this was extended to the revival, and from what I've read, the TV crew is still consulted in the writing of these audio dramas. RTD was consulted on the War Master sets, and Chris Chibnall was involved in development of the Fugitive Doctor series. It seems all they gotta do is ask. But even with all these legalities, I don't see the logic behind a clause in the contract that demands annual appearances from the Daleks. I found one source suggesting Terry Nation wanted them to return every year, but even if that's true, it would only apply to the classic series before the 2004 rights dispute. If I had to guess, I think fans jumped to conclusions over the new deal and created the idea of a contractual obligation. With at least 5 years without the Daleks, the lack of any evidence supporting it, and 2 showrunners stating otherwise, I have to conclude this rumour is not and never has been true.
So why do they come back so often?
Well, because they're the Daleks. Kids love imitating them in the playground, the toys are bestsellers, and they're a pop culture icon. Even Ncuti Gatwa is aching to meet them. Fans often moan about the Daleks being overused, and while I prefer having longer gaps between appearances, the kid in me loves seeing them pop up. I think the Jodie Whittaker era made the right move, relegating them to holiday specials, making their appearances feel rare and exciting. Russell has decided to give them a rest, which is a good call since they were used quite a lot in the previous era, but come on, who doesn't want to see the 15th Doctor face off against his arch-enemies? Their consistent appearances simply come down to their commercial viability and cultural status.
Why did I make this video, aside from being paid?
Because while this myth seems harmless, misinformation is all too common in the fandom, and a lot of it is anything but harmless. Looking through old forums, I didn't have to look hard for speculation about the personal lives of actors and crew, claims of behind-the-scenes drama, and more insidious stuff peddled by reactionaries. Remember Chaos in Cardiff? The obvious lie that Jodie Whittaker and Chris Chibnall stormed off set with a new Doctor and showrunner waiting in the wings?
This set Doctor Who Twitter into meltdown in 2019, all for something that wasn't even real. And just the other week, this has happened again thanks to The Sun.
We live in a scary time where public figures and politicians thrive on misinformation, pandering to conspiracy theorists and those willing to believe anything so long as it suits them. Rumours about a sci-fi show seem tiny in comparison but still contribute to this wider issue, especially with the show becoming a target for these kinds of figures in recent years. Don't believe everything you see online. Always check your sources and don't share anything unless you know it's true. I lose count of how many posts I see sharing unsupported facts and news with no attempt to cite sources. It leads to disappointment at best and unwarranted abuse towards creatives at worst. And while this Dalek rumour is among the least scandalous, it's one of the most persistent. If you see anyone commenting the Daleks have to appear or the Beeb will lose the rights, reply with this video. Call out misinformation when you see it, even if it's about a TV show.
You can consider this myth exterminated.